I want to say something that I've been sitting with for a while now, and I'm just going to say it directly because I think the comfortable version of this conversation isn't actually helping anybody. Most people in my generation are broke. Not broke like they're homeless, not broke like they can't afford food, but broke in this quiet, invisible way where every month ends with less than it started with, and there's no obvious reason why. The math doesn't add up and nobody can fully explain why. And what's frustrating is that it's not because they're lazy. It's not because they're irresponsible. It's not because they don't care about money. It's because there is a trap built into the exact system they were handed, and nobody pointed it out when they were being handed it. I'm just sitting here tonight, game running in the background, thinking about this, and I genuinely can't stop thinking about it. So I just want to talk through it. Let me tell you exactly where I was a couple years ago, because I think this is going to feel familiar. I was doing everything right on paper. I had a job. I was showing up, performing, getting decent reviews. I had a budget, loosely, and I was trying to be intentional about money in the way that every personal finance video told me to be. I wasn't buying things I didn't need. I wasn't eating out every night. I wasn't making the obvious mistakes. And yet every time I actually looked at my bank account honestly, not the optimistic version of looking at it, but the real version, I felt this low-grade anxiety that I couldn't shake. Like I was technically moving forward, but also somehow standing still. And I kept assuming it was a me problem, that I was doing something wrong, missing something obvious, failing some personal finance test that everyone else had somehow passed. And then at some point I stopped blaming myself long enough to actually look at the numbers from the outside. And what I saw was not a personal failure. What I saw was a structural gap that my generation got handed and then told was their fault. And that's the invisible trap. It's not one thing. It's not just rent being too high or wages being too low or student loans being too heavy. It's the combination of all of those things happening at the same time in the same economy, to the same generation, while the advice being handed down was written for a completely different era. And that combination is what keeps people quietly broke, even when they're trying hard and doing most things right. So let me actually break down what I mean, because I don't want this to just sound like venting. I want to be specific. Wages for entry-level positions, which is where most people in their 20s start, have not meaningfully kept up with the actual cost of living. And when I say actual cost of living, I don't mean the official inflation numbers. I mean what it actually costs to rent an apartment, buy groceries, put gas in a car, pay for insurance, and exist as a functional adult in 2025. That gap between what the entry-level job pays and what adult life actually costs is real, and it is wider than it was for any previous generation entering the workforce. And the frustrating part is that the response to that gap is almost always personal. Budget better, spend less, make your coffee at home. And those things are not wrong exactly, but they are wildly insufficient as solutions to a structural problem. You cannot coupon your way out of an economy that structurally underpays the people at the bottom of it. And then there's housing. I want to talk about housing specifically because I think this is the thing that has done the most psychological damage to people my age, and nobody talks about it in the right way. Buying a home was the foundational piece of the wealth-building formula that every previous generation was handed. You buy a house. It appreciates over time. You build equity. That equity becomes a financial cushion, and eventually it becomes a form of generational wealth. That was the plan. That was the whole middle-class blueprint. And for the generation before mine, it mostly worked. But home prices in most major American cities have increased so far beyond what median income allows that the entry point to that wealth-building mechanism is simply out of reach for a massive portion of my generation. And when you cut an entire generation out of the primary wealth-building tool that the previous generation used, the downstream consequences are not small. They compound over decades. But here's the part that I think is the actual trap, the invisible part of the invisible trap. It's not just the financial numbers. It's the mindset those numbers create. When you grow up watching your parents achieve stability through a set of steps, and then you follow those steps and stability doesn't show up, there's a specific kind of demoralization that happens. A quiet giving up that doesn't look like giving up because you're still going to work, still paying your bills, still technically functioning. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you've stopped believing that the future is actually going to be different from the present. And that belief, or the loss of it, is what keeps people stuck in the trap longer than the financial numbers alone would keep them. Because when you stop believing that building towards something is realistic, you stop building. And when you stop building, the trap closes completely. I spent time in that headspace and I recognize it immediately when I see it in other people. It looks like someone who is smart, capable, hardworking, and completely disengaged from any conversation about their financial future because those conversations feel like they're describing someone else's life. It looks like someone who spends money on small pleasures not because they're irresponsible, but because those small pleasures are the only part of their financial life that actually feels like it's in their control. It looks like someone who has technically heard all the advice, but can't make themselves act on it because some part of them doesn't believe it will actually work for them specifically. And I'm not judging that. I've been that person. I understand exactly why that happens.
What I want to do is explain why it happens in a way that stops feeling like a personal character flaw and starts feeling like a rational response to a broken set of instructions.
Okay, so here's where I want to shift, because I don't want this to just be an hour of identifying the problem without actually moving somewhere useful. And I want to be careful here because this is where a lot of conversations go wrong. They identify real structural problems, which is honest and necessary, and then they pivot into some version of hustle culture motivation that essentially puts all the responsibility back on the individual and pretends the structure doesn't exist. I'm not going to do that. But I also genuinely believe that understanding the trap clearly is the first step toward not being stuck in it. And there are real things that people are doing right now to build differently, not by ignoring the structural problems, but by working around them with a different set of tools than the ones the previous generation had. The first thing I had to actually accept, and this was harder than it sounds, is that the traditional path was not going to deliver the outcome it promised on the timeline it promised. Not because I was doing it wrong, but because the math genuinely doesn't work the way it used to. And once I accepted that clearly, not resentfully, not as an excuse to stop trying, but just as a factual assessment of the situation, I could start thinking about what actually does work in the current environment instead of just feeling confused about why the old thing wasn't working. That acceptance sounds small, but it's actually huge because most people are still emotionally committed to the old plan working out even while the evidence is telling them it isn't. And that split is exhausting. What actually works right now, and I want to be direct about this without overselling it, is leverage. Not leverage in a complicated financial instrument sense, but leverage in the basic sense of doing something once that continues to create value over time. The traditional employment model is fundamentally anti-leverage. You trade an hour of your time for a fixed amount of money, period. When you stop trading the hours, the money stops. And for most jobs, there's a ceiling on how much that hourly rate can grow regardless of how good you get at the work. Digital skills, content, audiences, online income streams, all of those things have a different economic structure underneath them. The work you do today can continue creating value next week, next month, next year, in a way that trading hours simply cannot. And that structural difference is worth understanding clearly because it changes how you think about where to invest your time and energy. Now, I want to say something honest about the digital income conversation because I think the way it gets presented online is genuinely misleading in a way that ends up hurting people. The path to building any kind of meaningful online income is not fast, not passive in the beginning, not guaranteed, and not for everyone in the same form. I've seen people build real things through content creation. I've seen people build real things through freelancing. I've seen people use geographic arbitrage, meaning they earn in dollars while living somewhere their dollars go significantly further, and completely change their financial situation, not by earning more, but by changing the denominator. These things are real and they work, but they work through sustained effort over long periods of time, not through a system or a shortcut or a course that promises to condense the process. And here's what I think is actually the most important thing I can say in this whole conversation. The trap that keeps Gen Z quietly broke is not just about money. It's about the story people are telling themselves about what's possible for them specifically in this economy at this moment in time. Because the people I've watched actually change their financial situation, they didn't all do it the same way. Some of them built audiences. Some of them developed skills that they freelanced. Some of them moved somewhere cheaper. Some of them started small businesses. But what they all had in common is that at some point they stopped waiting for the traditional path to deliver results it had stopped delivering. Then they started building something in a direction that made sense for the world as it actually is right now, not the world as it was supposed to be. The other thing I want to address directly is this idea that if you're struggling financially, it's because you're not disciplined enough, not focused enough, not making the right choices. And I want to push back on that hard because I think it does real damage. Discipline matters. Financial choices matter. I'm not dismissing any of that. But when the structural conditions of an economy make it genuinely harder for an entire generation to build wealth through the traditional methods, and then the response is entirely individual, budget better, work harder, want less. It shifts responsibility in a way that isn't fair and isn't accurate. You can be the most disciplined person in the room and still be caught in a structural problem that individual discipline alone cannot solve. Understanding that doesn't let you off the hook for your own choices. It just means you stop mistaking a systemic problem for a personal failure. And that distinction matters enormously for how you respond to the situation. So where does this actually leave us? And I want to be honest about this rather than landing on something artificially optimistic. The structural problems are real, and they are not going to be fixed quickly. Housing is not going to become affordable in most cities in the next few years. Wages at the entry level are not going to dramatically outpace inflation anytime soon.
The traditional path to middle-class stability is not going to suddenly open back up and deliver everything it used to deliver. Those things are true, and I think it's important to say them clearly because pretending otherwise leads people to keep waiting for something that isn't coming. But here's what I also know. The tools available to someone in their 20s right now to build something outside of that traditional path are genuinely more accessible than they have ever been at any other point in history. A laptop, an internet connection, a real skill, and the willingness to show up consistently over time is enough to build a real alternative. Not overnight, not without difficulty, but enough. And the people who are going to look back on this period and feel okay about how they navigated it are not going to be the ones who waited for the system to fix itself. They're going to be the ones who understood the trap clearly, stopped blaming themselves for being in it, and started building something that worked with the actual rules of the actual economy they were living in, rather than the rules they were promised would apply. The invisible trap only stays invisible until you see it. And once you see it, once you really understand what it is and why it exists, and what it's actually doing to your relationship with money and your belief in your own future, the thing loses some of its power over you. And that's where it actually starts. Not with a better budget or a new income stream or a motivational push, with seeing the thing clearly for what it is. Most people in my generation are quietly broke, not because they're failing, because they're following instructions that were written for someone else's economy.